There are a few sunken warships that resonate through the years, quite like USS Juneau, a brand new cruiser sent to the bottom in a catastrophic explosion. An explosion so large and violent that those aboard the other ships were convinced there couldn't be any survivors. As it turned out, they were wrong. Some 100 men floated in the cold waters after Juneau went under. By the time the last of them left the water, only 10 survivors remained. Among the lost were, of course, the Sullivan Brothers. Their loss directly contributed to the implementation of the sole survivor policy, as well as the service of 2 destroyers named for the brothers as a group. One surviving as a museum ship, and the second, USS the Sullivans, remaining in active service to this day. What of Juneau herself, though? Her shattered wreck slipped beneath the waves within 20 seconds, and was subsequently lost to history. When Iron Bottom Sound was surveyed in the 1990s, Juneau was not one of the wrecks discovered. Instead, her wreck would not be found until March 17, 2018, by Paul Allen's expedition on RV Petrel, one of several wrecks found by that group and that ship. As could be expected, Juneau is in pieces, her hull torn, twisted, and blown apart. And yet, for all of that, still recognizable. She is, however, very much a gravesite. Hundreds of her crew rest with her. It is worth remembering that as we look at the remains of USS Juneau. To begin here, I will note that I have already done a video on Juneau's history. As such, I will link that in the description, and just say this about her sinking. Juneau was hit by 2 torpedoes in her final actions. The first did severe damage, forcing her to withdraw for repairs. The second, from the submarine I-26, hit in more or less the same location as the first. This alone might have been enough to sink her, the weakened hull breaking from 2 direct hits in the same location. Unfortunately for the ship, these direct hits were near her magazines. The resultant explosion blew her apart and sent Juneau to the bottom very quickly. Considering the severity of her sinking, it should not be a surprise to find her wreck scattered on the bottom, as I said before. Nonetheless, there are some surprises in her wreck, and we'll look at those now. First and foremost, Juneau is a deep wreck. Her sister Atlanta is in fairly shallow water. Shallow enough for scuba diving, albeit on the very edge of safety. Juneau, by contrast, is 13,800 feet, 4,200 meters beneath the surface. This has kept her safe from salvage, and contributed to how long it took to find her. It has also given her the typical preservation of deep-water American warship wrecks, obvious explosion damage aside. Before I move on to that, though, it is important to look at the sonar. There are interesting things here that I'll look at in more detail later. For example, the fact that not only is Juneau in pieces, but her stern landed on top of her bow on the bottom, a full 1,968 feet, 600 meters, from the main part of her hull. This has led to some of the most distinctive images of her wreck, including her nameplate resting atop the bow. It is also why there is a distinct lack of pictures of her bow, because it is broken and buried beneath mud and her own stern. Near to that mess of steel, then, you can see a debris field. This, among other things, has one of her 5-inch mounts, which is torn apart, as well as an accompanying gun director. This is something you expect to see on a wreck that blew apart like Juneau did. More surprisingly, her rudder broke off from her stern and is resting some distance away. This is a rare thing to see in its own right, but the fact it isn't buried in the bottom and is recognizably her rudder is even stranger. With the sonar done, though, let's move on to the pictures of the wreck. This will not be as nice to look at as Hornet was. Of course, the first thing to look at here needs to be the stern, and the bow resting beneath it. This was how Petrel identified the ship as Juneau, because her name is still legible on the very end of the ship. The metal is rusted and the hull is broken, but enough letters are still plainly visible to make out the name Juneau. Much as with the nameplate on Lexington, this made it clear which ship they had found, even if the other distinctive features of an Atlanta-class cruiser had not done the same. Past this, there's also the mangled and ruined bow that the stern is resting on. This is, as you could expect, flattened into the mud and generally almost unrecognizable. The only recognizable thing is an anchor, still attached and firmly locked in place. In common with other wrecks, the anchor is well preserved. You can even make out writing on the bottom of it. However, the wreckage around the anchor, mounting point aside, is just twisted metal, unrecognizable for what it once was. And, unfortunately, as a result of her explosive end, there's not much more to see here. You can see the depth charge racks on her stern, complete with depth charges. This isn't surprising when the majority of the intact parts of her wreck are on the main hull, as we'll look at now. I'll note here that it is something of a surprise how well preserved this section of the wreck really is. The hull rests upright on the bottom, with much of her superstructure and weapons intact. Her torpedo tubes remain firmly in place, as do some of her 5-inch gun mounts. Not all of them, and some of these weapons do show damage, but they're still aboard the ship, and that's an impressive thing to see. Now, to look at this in descending order of size, let's start with the 5-inch guns. I'll leave the one in the debris field for later, and focus on the ship here. First off, the port side mount is pointing out from the ship, with one gun elevated skyward, and the other more or less on a flat angle. These guns are not quite preserved enough to see paint, but they are mostly clear of major rusting or marine life. This allows for seeing both the rifling inside the gun itself, as well as the sighting system on the side of the mount. You can see these periscopes on each of the mounts remaining aboard the ship, although this particular one doesn't have a close-up look at it. On the other hand, the next mount that Petrel photographed did get close-ups of the periscopes. This one, the starboard side mount, is in rougher shape, for all that it remains largely intact. Both mount and guns are at an angle, with the guns pointing down to the bottom. It's a forlorn kind of look in a lot of ways. However, the close-up picture of the periscopes is important here. First, because of the close-up showing how well the metal has endured the decades beneath the surface. And because of the periscope itself, which is more or less intact, aside from missing its protective cover. Moving past that though, this mount looks more or less the same as the previous one. That leaves only 2 more mounts remaining aboard the ship, at least that Petrel took pictures of, so that is where we'll move now. One of these is probably the most interesting of the bunch in several ways. First off, you have the angle these mounts are resting at. It seems that this part of the ship collapsed during the sinking, which considering these particular mounts are at the center line, isn't very surprising. It is probably near where the ship broke, and shows the signs of that. One mount also shows signs of paint, although faded to the point it is difficult to make out the color. This paint is mostly notable for 2 reasons. First, that you can see where the paint is replaced by rust in the upper corner. Secondly, you can also see a distinct E in the center of the mount. That is a Battle Effectiveness Award, or Battle Efficiency Award, depending on the time frame you're looking at. Juno, as a new ship when she went down, was showing a good, well-performing crew to earn that so quickly. The last thing of note on this mount is that a hatch is hanging open on the back of it, thrown open by the force of the explosion in all likelihood, and frozen in that position for decades. As for the other mount, well, I haven't seen any good images of it. With the final 5-inch mounts on the main hull covered, it is time to move on to the torpedo tubes. These remain fairly unique on American cruiser wrecks, as by the time the United States entered World War II, these had largely been removed from the cruiser force. They endured on the antique Omaha class and on the brand new Atlantas. So seeing these on a cruiser instead of a destroyer is a very rare sight. In the case of Juno, the torpedo tubes show varying levels of damage. The port side mount has a crane collapsed on top of its blast shield, crumpling that down. The tubes themselves seem to be mostly intact, complete with their weapons still in place. Or, at the least, there isn't any easily visible damage to the tubes themselves, as you can see here. This is a distinction to make, because the other set of tubes is not that nice. While it doesn't have a crane on top of it, the starboard set is missing one of its tubes. 3 of the tubes remain fixed in place, trained out over the side of the ship. The intact tubes still have their fish, just like in the other mount. But the 4th tube is notably missing, likely torn away when the ship sank. though it's impossible to know that for sure. Interestingly, behind the tubes, you can see open hatches leading inside the ship's superstructure. Well, one open hatch, and one hatch detached and resting on the deck in front of the opening it once covered. That aside, going back to the tubes, you can see some silt atop them and in the background of this shot, as well as the torpedo stop mechanism, better seen in this image, which kept the tubes from moving in most circumstances, the exceptions being loading or firing. You can still make out writing on here, although it's showing definite signs of deterioration. This plaque was placed there to provide instruction on how to load a torpedo into the tube. The last shot of these tubes is a picture of both the torpedo tubes and the starboard 5-inch mount. It's another angle on those guns, but it also shows more damage to the torpedo tubes. The ends are bent and twisted, covering up the torpedo still inside the launcher. However, that ends Juno's offensive weaponry, which just leaves her dedicated anti-aircraft guns. These consisted of 20mm cannons, seen here, and the ubiquitous early war quad 1.1-inch mount. Petrel, on this wreck, didn't take any really close shots of the 20mm cannon like they did on other ships, so it's difficult to pick out much in the way of detail on the guns themselves. Though it is notable that the gun tubs are still largely intact, considering the damage all around them. As for the Chicago piano mount, well, I use the singular there for a reason. Only one mount was photographed by the Petrel expedition, covered in silt and mud. It seems to be in worse shape than the equivalent mounts on the Hornet wreck, with one of the barrels bent down behind the other three. In any case, though, with that we come to an end for weaponry still aboard the cruiser. So with that in mind, I'll cover the cruiser herself, from her superstructure to her hull, and then the debris field to round things off. First, and most importantly, let's look at the break in her hull. There are only a couple pictures of this, although both are enlightening, and show the sheer violence in the explosion that sent Juno to the bottom in the first place. This first picture, after all, shows her hull peeled back, like someone took a can and peeled it open. Admittedly, Juno wasn't the most heavily armored or heavily built ship in the world, but that image is still striking for just how much force it had to have taken to do that. This is strong steel, and it looks like a tin can. Her port side, which this shows, was blown out by the explosion. Her starboard side, on the other hand, doesn't look quite as distinctive. Instead, it is, as strange as it sounds to say this, a more typical look at a broken ship. Torn and twisted metal, with debris resting around the break itself. Not pretty to look at by any means, and a sign of the power of the explosion. But it doesn't have the same visceral feeling of the peeled back hull on the port side. In the end, though, those two images are the only pictures of the break that I've been able to find, which leaves a couple pictures of the superstructure to round out the main hull. The first of which is the remnants of her funnel, seen here. This was made of thin steel, and has clearly fared worse than the tougher hull itself. It's impossible to know how damaged it was in the initial explosion, but time has not been kind to the funnel at all. That said, I'm almost impressed that Juno still has any of her funnel at all. Not every ship that went down has that, and considering her overall condition, it's kind of impressive in a way. Moving on from that, however, we have the base of the funnel by the 20mm mounts. This area is more intact, although the silent march of time and rust is clearly visible. Her frames are exposed, with most of the metal covering long gone. This is an area I would expect to be in worse shape if a follow-up expedition ever visits the cruiser. This area is also the second to last part of the superstructure to look at, because with her bridge structure missing, the only remaining pictures of Juno's superstructure come from one of her 5-inch gun directors, the stern one in this case. Now, this is an interesting thing to look at. This Mark 37 director still has blue paint clearly visible, which makes it one of the best preserved areas of paint on the wreck. Equally as interesting, all of the hatches are open, which allows for looking at the observation and telescopic ports. This isn't unique to Juno by any means, as Johnson had a similarly open director. But Juno's is in very, very good shape. It is also an interesting look at an early war model of the Mark 37 instead of a late war or even post-war model. You can even see the rangefinder sticking out of the side. And for that matter, even the base of the rangefinder platform is still firmly in place, in direct comparison to the 5-inch gun mount tilted over nearby. However, past this point, there's nothing else, released anyway, of the main hull superstructure. That just leaves the debris field, which has some interesting items in its own right. I'll begin with the final 5-inch gun mount that was located on this expedition. This one is resting in the debris field, broken in two. Considering the fact it was blown from the hull and had half the mount itself torn off, I think it's a safe bet to make that this was near the explosion itself. The force of which would have been more than enough to do this kind of damage to the thinly built 5-inch mount. It does lead to a fascinating picture, though. While you can visit similar mounts on museum ships, you don't get this kind of almost cutaway view of one of these mounts. That being said, I don't even want to think about what happened to the men inside, but from an archaeological perspective, it is a very rare sight. On a less morbid note, the next piece to cover is one of the cruiser's boilers. Much as with Lexington's wreck, this is resting in the mud, well away from anything else. It is in worse shape than the aircraft carrier's boiler, though, with the tube crumpled atop the main body of the boiler. After the boiler, though, there are only 3 more things of note in the debris field. First, another fire control director. This one was blown clean off the ship and rests closer to the bow and stern. The picture on screen now is a good one that shows the kind of preservation on a wreck at this depth, even one as damaged as Juno. You can still see writing on the exposed rangefinder. You wouldn't see something like that on a shallower wreck, more exposed to the elements and sea life. After that, the second to last bit of debris is a part of Juno's superstructure resting in the mud, most likely from the forward part of the ship, as this part seems to have been completely destroyed. The bow was, as mentioned, crumpled and buried beneath the stern, and everything forward of the amidships points is missing on the main part of the wreck. Unfortunately, beyond probably part of the forward superstructure, it is hard to really say what this is. Lack of context and other recognizable pieces of the ship make that a tough task. On the other hand, the last piece of debris is easily recognizable. And that's Juno's rudder, torn from the stern and resting alone in the debris. Inverted in the debris at that. I can't, off the top of my head, recall any other wrecks quite like this. Normally the rudder is completely buried in the mud, but still attached to the ship. And if it's gone, well, it's gone. No sign of it to be found. Juno's rudder being inverted on its own like this is, I think, unique. Or at least incredibly rare, as I mentioned at the start of the video. That does, however, bring us to an end on Juno's wreck. A remarkably intact wreck, considering how violent and rapid her sinking was. I have to respect Petrel and Paul Allen for finding her. Thanks to their efforts, those who lost family aboard the ship finally know what happened to her. They can see what remains of the grave of fathers, brothers, cousins, and so on. That's why I cover these. That's why people like Allen or Vulcan or Kaladin look for these. To give closure, in a way, and to keep the memory alive for future generations. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.